A man was exploring an unknown underground cave alone, but as the passage suddenly narrowed, a massive rock weighing dozens of pounds broke loose and pinned his left leg down. Even worse, as he struggled to free himself, the cave wall collapsed again, burying him completely from the chest down and leaving him unable to move. A massive rescue operation was launched immediately. For half a month, rescue crews tried every possible method, but just when he was about to be saved, an accident no one could have predicted happened. This is the story of the extreme rescue at Sand Cave in the United States. It was the middle of winter. To make crawling through the cave easier, Collins did what he usually did. He hung his jacket and hat near the entrance before going inside. But he had no idea that disaster was silently closing in. He carefully crouched down, raised his kerosene lantern, and crawled deeper into the cave. As he went farther in, the passage became narrower. Collins had no choice but to lie flat and crawl forward with his body pressed tightly against the ground. Because he had already widened parts of the cave before, some sections of the structure had become unstable. Along the way, he also had to watch out for falling rocks. After crawling about 15 meters, he reached a larger space known as the turnaround chamber. But beyond that point, the space became a narrow crack. For an experienced cave explorer like Collins, this was nothing unusual. He pressed both arms tightly against his body, took a deep breath, compressed his chest, twisted his waist and abdomen, and used his feet to push against the ground, inching forward little by little. After squeezing through several narrow cracks and vertical shafts, Collins finally reached the front of a vertical tunnel. This tunnel was only about 20 centimeters wide, so narrow that it was barely enough for him to pass through. Collins exhaled, tightened his body, and slid more than 2 meters down along the rock wall. His feet successfully landed on solid ground. When he saw the wide chamber in front of him, Collins was filled with excitement. As long as he widened the tunnel and reinforced the areas that were likely to collapse with supports, Sand Cave could eventually become a paid tourist attraction. Collins's dream was finally within reach. But after working for several hours, his kerosene lantern began to flicker and dim. So Collins immediately decided to turn back toward the exit. He climbed back up to the upper ledge and pushed the kerosene lantern ahead of him. Then he rolled onto his back, keeping both arms tight against his sides. He took a deep breath and squeezed his body back into the narrow crack. But as he struggled forward and pushed the lantern ahead, he accidentally bumped it, causing the flame to go out. The entire cave instantly fell into darkness. Still, Collins had a general understanding of the cave's layout. Even without light, he believed it would not be a major problem. But just as he pushed his legs against the rock wall, trying to squeeze out of the crack, a 34-kilogram rock suddenly broke loose, and it landed directly on his left leg, pinning it down completely. Collins desperately twisted his body, trying to pull his leg free from beneath the rock. But then things got even worse. As he struggled, a large amount of loose rock from the cave wall above him came crashing down. In an instant, the roar of falling stones and thick dust filled the entire tunnel. He was completely buried from the chest down. That meant both of his arms were trapped tightly against his body, and he could not move at all. Dust and debris choked him so badly that he could barely breathe. Although he was only 18 meters below the surface, Collins had no way to get out. After struggling for several hours, he gave up. Collins took several deep breaths and forced himself to calm down. After all, his jacket and hat were still hanging near the cave entrance. He thought to himself that sooner or later, someone would come looking for him. After calming down, he gradually fell asleep, at least temporarily escaping the nightmare. But when he woke up again, reality hit him like a bucket of cold water. All Collins could do was keep shouting, struggling until he was exhausted, passing out, then waking up and repeating the cycle again and again. Early the next morning, his neighbor Beasley learned that Collins had not returned all night. Beasley's 17-year-old son, Jewel, also found Collins's clothes outside Sand Cave. Realizing something might be wrong, Jewel tried to crawl inside to check, but because he had no cave exploring experience, he was stopped by the narrow passage after reaching the turnaround chamber. Although he could not get to Collins, he was close enough to hear Collins back. Jewel quickly climbed back to the surface to get help. After people learned someone was trapped inside the cave, several local residents crawled in and tried to rescue him. But they also only made it as far as the turnaround chamber. At 4 p.m., Collins's 22-year-old brother, Homer, arrived at the scene. Even though he understood the danger clearly, he knew his brother had gone more than 30 hours without food, so he crawled inside, carrying food with him. Homer crawled all the way to the vertical shaft above Collins. Then he took off his clothes and shoes, leaving only his underwear on, and slid down. But what he saw sent chills down his spine. The tunnel beside Collins was extremely narrow, and it was also a vertical shaft. If rescuers entered the chute head first, they would have to work upside down to free Collins, and when trying to get out, they would have to use their feet for leverage and back out with extreme difficulty for at least 3 meters before they could even turn around. But entering feet first, the way Homer did not work either. After his feet touched the ground, even if he twisted his body into an almost impossible position, it was still extremely difficult to help Collins. And because Collins was completely pinned from the chest down, both his hands hands and feet were buried tightly against the inside of his body. Homer could only feed his brother small pieces of food by hand. After that, Homer tried to move the rock pinning his brother down, but every time he moved anything, new stones kept rolling down and filling the empty space again. There was nothing he could do. A few hours later, Homer crawled back out of the cave. His entire body was shaking, and the skin on his fingers was torn. Afterward, many other people tried to enter the cave, but all of them failed. Late that night, Homer went back into the cave alone with a crowbar. He desperately tried to pry loose the massive rock pressing against his brother's chest. 8 hours later, Homer's arms and back were aching badly, but the rock still had not moved at all. At sunrise, Homer climbed out of the cave in despair. On February 1st, as the news of Collins being trapped spread rapidly through the local area, more and more people gathered outside the cave entrance. Some suggested that Collins should try to untie his shoelaces. Others said they should use dynamite to widen the cave, but all of it was just talk. No one actually took action. Homer felt helpless. On the morning of February 2nd, 8 members of the Kentucky National Guard arrived at Sand Cave. Their job was partly to help with the digging work and partly to maintain order at the scene. That same day, a young reporter named William Miller also arrived after hearing the news, hoping to interview Homer. Seeing Miller dressed in a suit, Homer clearly had no interest in being interviewed. He casually pointed toward the cave entrance and said that if Miller wanted answers, he could go inside and see for himself. Water dripping from above kept falling onto Collins's face. It reminded Miller of an ancient water torture. The constant dripping sound was almost driving Collins insane. Miller tried to ask him a few questions, but Collins was mentally agitated and answered incoherently. Knowing he could not help, Miller had no choice but to turn back. With his muscles trembling the entire time and his teeth chattering, Miller took half an hour to make it back to the surface. Since the rescue could not be completed simply by clearing loose rocks, the people above ground discussed other options. A local firefighter named Robert Burton then proposed a risky plan. They would use a rope to forcibly pull Collins out. Even though brute force could tear off his left leg, Collins's only thought now was to escape as quickly as possible, even if it meant losing a leg. So, after getting Collins's own consent, at 5 p.m. that afternoon, Homer entered the dark cave again with a 30-meter rope, followed by Miller and Robert. To calm his brother down, Homer first fed Collins a sandwich, coffee, and whiskey. With his family beside him, Collins gradually relaxed. Then Homer used a spoon to give his brother a sedative and tied the rope around his chest, securing the knot tightly. Miller crouched near the vertical shaft, while Robert stayed farther back. Near the cave entrance, many others were ready to help. As soon as Homer finished the countdown, the rope was pulled tight. Collins's upper body was slowly lifted, but his left foot was still firmly trapped. The agonizing pull made Collins let out a terrible scream. Hearing his brother's cries grow louder and louder, Homer finally couldn't take it anymore. He shouted for the people above to stop pulling, then began pulling the rope back in the opposite direction. With the rescue attempt forced to stop, everything returned to where it had started. There had been no progress at all. That night, Collins's close friend Johnny Gerald heard the news and rushed to the scene. As Collins's best exploration partner, the two had often explored new caves together. Once, when Collins had become trapped inside Crystal Cave, it was Gerald who helped rescue him. After learning what had happened, Gerald was furious about Robert's plan to forcibly drag his friend out. He then entered the cave himself. With his skilled technique, Gerald made it smoothly through the first half of the passage, but because he was strongly built, he had a hard time squeezing through the 3-meter vertical shaft. After spending 3 hours widening the cave wall, Gerald finally reached Collins around midnight. The arrival of his friend gave Collins hope again. For the next several hours, Gerald worked hard to clear the loose rocks around Collins. He filled buckets again and again, climbed back up, emptied them, then returned. Slowly, Collins's torso was exposed, then his hips, then his thighs. For the first time, Collins was able to move his right leg, but because of Gerald's larger build, clearing rocks down to the thigh area was already the absolute limit of what he could do. After 6 hours of removing half a ton of rock, the exhausted Gerald returned to the surface. On the 5th day of Collins's entrapment, the smaller William Miller took over Gerald's task. He led more than a dozen men into the cave. Some were responsible for passing food, while others moved rocks out of the way. Whenever they had a free moment, they used wooden boards to reinforce the cave walls. Miller went directly to Collins and continued clearing the deeper debris. As his light illuminated the deeper part of the cave, Miller finally saw what they had not fully understood before. The rock had not only pinned Collins's foot down, its other end had slipped into a crack below. That meant the rock was wedged in place like a trap. It could not be pushed, and it could not be pulled free. Fortunately, Collins was still in relatively decent condition. He remained conscious and began opening up to Miller, speaking from the heart. After returning to the surface, Miller discussed the situation with several experts. They decided to use a jack to lift the massive rock, and once again, because of his small size, Miller was chosen to carry out the task. That evening, Miller brought the tools into the depths of the cave. According to the plan, he would slide down feet first, then turn himself over onto Collins's body. After that, he would wedge a crowbar against the rock and use the jack to lift the stone off Collins's foot. The idea sounded good in theory, but actually carrying it out was extremely difficult. First, the space was so tight that Miller could barely generate any force, and if the jack was not fixed perfectly, it could easily slip out of place. After repeated failures, Miller twisted his body into an extreme position. Then, during one attempt, the huge rock actually began to move. It was only slight, but it gave both men tremendous hope. Miller stared at the stone, his arms trembling as he used all his strength to press down on the handle. The rock seemed to slowly rise with it, but at that critical moment, the jack slipped again. The stone slammed back into place, landing directly on Collins's left foot once more. For the next several hours, Miller tried over and over to secure the jack. He added wooden blocks, changed positions, and searched for a stable support point. Collins did not stay silent either. Again and again, he encouraged Miller and urged him to keep going. By around 1 in the morning, Miller was completely exhausted. His hands were numb and his whole body ached. But the massive rock still would not move. Before leaving, Miller covered Collins with a blanket. Then he hung a light bulb around Collins's neck to help keep him warm before crawling out of the cave in disappointment. But the situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. On the 6th day of Collins's entrapment, after many volunteers had entered the cave repeatedly, and after meltwater from the campfires outside flowed into the tunnel, the temperature and humidity inside the cave began to fluctuate. This made the already fragile tunnel extremely unstable. Before long, another collapse occurred inside the cave. A crash echoed from the entrance, but Johnny Gerald still stepped forward. Risking being buried alive, he crawled back into the tunnel to rescue his friend. Over the next 8 hours, Gerald entered and exited Sand Cave at least 5 times. As he went, he cleared loose rocks from the path and reinforced the cave walls with wooden boards. At last, he successfully reopened the blocked passage. Although the passage was still extremely narrow, it was at least wide enough for him to bring food to his friend. At that moment, Collins began to cry. He had thought no one would ever come back to save him. By this point, Gerald felt that they could not delay any longer. After all, the cave could collapse again at any moment. When he returned to the surface, he gathered more people and planned to coat the rock with Vaseline. This time, he was determined to free his friend. But when Gerald entered the cave again, he was stunned. The ceiling had collapsed even more severely. Loose rocks, sand, and mud had completely blocked the passage. Gerald shouted toward the inside, but all he heard was Collins's weak voice answering back. Seeing that his friend's condition was getting worse, Gerald tried to keep clearing a path, but the rocks above seemed endless. As soon as he cleared one section, more debris collapsed from overhead. At one point, a large rock struck him directly in the back. Gerald broke down. He knew that if he did not leave immediately, he would be crushed to death inside as well, so he had no choice but to turn back at once and crawl toward the cave entrance. When he finally made it out, the collapsing debris behind him sealed the passage completely. Seeing Gerald sitting at the cave entrance and crying, Homer also tried to go in and rescue his brother, but the guards at the scene stopped him. By this point, entering the cave again meant facing an enormous risk of death, and even if someone did manage to get inside, there was no longer any way to provide Collins with meaningful help. After evaluating the situation, officials decided to do whatever it took to rescue Collins by digging a vertical shaft from the surface. On February 6, the digging officially began. The plan was to first dig a vertical shaft about 17 meters deep, then tunnel horizontally until they reached Collins's location. At first, the rescuers were very optimistic. They estimated that with 75 volunteers working in shifts day and night, they could reach Collins in no more than 30 hours. During this time, Miller's reports appeared in more than 1,200 newspapers across the country. Radio stations also broadcast Collins's story non-stop. In 1925, radio was still a relatively new technology. Its incredible speed of communication brought an unprecedented crowd to Sand Cave. At the time, the cave entrance was packed with thousands of rescuers, curious spectators, and vendors selling food and souvenirs. According to public records, the crowd may have reached as many as 50,000 people at its peak. But the larger the crowd became, the more rumors spread. Some claimed the entire event was a hoax created by Collins himself. Others said no one was actually trapped in the cave. There were even people who came forward pretending to be Collins, forcing the governor to publicly deny the rumors. Meanwhile, before the vertical shaft was even halfway finished, problems kept appearing one after another. Sometimes the diggers hit hard layers of rock. Sometimes the equipment broke down. The walls of the shaft collapsed from time to time. Then sudden heavy rain made things even worse. On top of all that, the rescue workers kept arguing among themselves. A digging operation that had originally been expected to take 30 hours ended up taking 12 full days. But in the end, they were still one step too late. When rescuers finally entered the tunnel, they found Collins completely motionless. A medical examiner later came down and officially confirmed his death. Based on the condition of the scene, it was estimated that he had died only about 3 days earlier. That meant after the final collapse, Collins had managed to survive inside the cave for 9 full days. But the lack of food eventually took his life there in the darkness.